Greetings! I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to build this wrecked house from Warlord games. I thought it would be a good idea to have some more terrain for my future solo bolt-action games. There's a link to the most recent one in the description, and I figured it might be a good idea to do something a little more simple this week, and this kit certainly fits the bill. As we can see, the back of the box has a couple of images of the completed model and a handy-dandy set of instruction diagrams, which is nice because I couldn't find any instructions online and there are none in the box. In fact, all that's in the box is an advertising pamphlet, a sprue of parts, and a base for the structure. Quite simple. The detailing on these parts, while not especially complex, they are just walls and floors after all, is pretty nice and neat. The gaps in the bricks are nice and deep and should hold washers nicely. There's a lot of cracking, chipping, and pitting in all the surfaces, which does seem fitting for a building that has seemingly been destroyed in combat. The sandbags and wooden parts look pretty good too. The parts are chunky and sturdy looking, and they're pretty well moulded with no visible defects. They do have quite heavy mould lines, but these are around the outsides of the parts and should be easy enough to clean up. There's not much detail to potentially damage here while scraping them off. One thing that did bug me a little bit was this part. It seems like a poor design choice to put this here, and while it should be easy enough to clean up, I can see it being a little bit annoying to remove. The first step in building this is of course to remove the mould lines. There's no need to be too neat with this on the areas that won't be visible, like along the bottom of the parts. I take a little bit more time with the areas that will be visible, like the cracked and broken away sections. It's no more difficult than removing mould lines from just about any other model, though it is still the most time-consuming part of the build. That's not unusual though. I start by gluing on two of the walls that will meet at a 90-degree angle, just to be sure that I don't have them on at a weird angle or anything like that. Assembly of this model is really quite simple. Make sure you choose the correct locations for each part and then glue them on like so. There are pins and corresponding holes on most parts to ensure that everything is positioned correctly. This is both a good and bad thing. It ensures good positioning, but it also prevents some gaps from being closed. This corner here is probably the worst on the entire model. It's a big gap, and even though I applied pressure here for a while, the gap just won't go away because the pins limit the lateral movement of the part. If the pins weren't there, I could easily slide the wall parts right up against each other for a nice gap-free finish. I don't think this particular gap can be explained away as a gap in the mortar. Filler will have to be used here, I think. I then build two upper floor sub-assemblies. These are simple. The support beam part slots right into the bottom of the broken floor chunk. Just make sure to use the correct parts. They are numbered, so it's pretty easy to not screw up. I quite like these support beams, and I think they add a lot of depth and interest to the model. I then install the smaller of the two sub-assemblies. It goes here. The pins guide its position quite adequately, but they won't hold it there, so I improvise a little. I quickly attach this middle chunk of wall. It's a pretty tight fit to get this all together. The plastic isn't very flexible and a little bit of force is needed to coax the parts into place. They do get there eventually though. I think it actually looks pretty cool. A little too gappy, but not awful. Then I attach the other side wall. Again, it took a little bit of force to get it to go into place owing to the guideposts, but it's not particularly difficult to get the part on. I apply pressure in an attempt to minimize gaps. It was only moderately successful. It makes sense to then follow this with the rear wall. Or is it the front? Let's just call it the rear. This one actually slipped into place quite easily with only a small amount of force. It's also got the least gaps too. Not bad at all. Then comes the other broken roof chunk. The locating pins are there, but it took me a little nudging and guessing to actually find them. Again, I applied pressure, but the gaps persist. At least these kind of look like a logical place for gaps to exist. Next, some internal stairs. These are as simple to install as it looks. They're a little bit thin, but they don't look too bad otherwise. Now for some sandbagging. There's two pieces of sandbag wall that go on this upper level. I believe these are optional, but I think they look good, so I put them on. The longer of the two parts should go on first, because the short part has a sandbag that hangs over on top of the long section. Looks like a good spot for a sniper team. More sandbags are included for the window. This one fits very well in the lower window, and I would expect it also fits into the upper window. I like it better downstairs. There's a set for the doorway too. They'd probably fit in the other doorway too, but I wanted them to all be in the front to make it look like that's where the occupants of this ruin have been hanging out. Then comes a downspout. This is easy enough to install, though it does take a little bit of fiddling to position it right. I like that the ends of this are hollow, just adds that little extra touch of realism. It's quite a nice little detail part if you ask me. The door comes next. I like that you can put this just about any way you want. Open, closed, blown off and on the ground like the box art illustrates. I've chosen to leave it still on its hinges and open because I think it looks kind of interesting that way. The final detail is this fallen beam. I glue it in here because why not? It might be a little bit tricky to paint around, but that's a problem for future Herbert to worry about. There's also a handful of individual sandbags that can be added to taste. I haven't used any because I'm lazy and didn't see it as necessary, and that's the wrecked house completed. I'm not going to compare this with another building, but it would be a good idea to compare this with a bolt action figure, and, well, it doesn't look especially convincing, does it? Most doors on houses aren't that small. Even very tall people can use the average door without smashing their foreheads on the door frame. Except freakishly tall people, and I don't think Mortimer here is freakishly tall. Even if we took away Mortimer's base, he would still probably hit his head on the top of the door frame. It looks to me like they've shrunk the entire model down from a larger scale and just gone a little bit too far. Even if the proportions of the doors were correct, I would still want it to be larger floor space wise. More like the size of the Plastruct buildings that I have. Don't get me wrong, I think it looks pretty good, it's just a little bit small. In the end, this is not a highly detailed display piece, it's a piece of gaming terrain. Its purpose is mostly blocking line of sight and providing cover for little plastic shooty-mans. Or metal shooty-mans, discrimination is wrong. I think it works very well as a piece of terrain. The kit does have its positives too. It was very quick and easy to build, and I think the result looks quite good. Unsurprisingly, the hardest and most time-consuming part of the build was mould line removal. The gaps that are there and shouldn't be and can't be explained away as gaps in the stonework shouldn't be too hard to fill in. The parts are nice and chunky, which means it should stand up to some fairly heavy use on the tabletop. The detail is pretty good. The gaps between the bricks and the nicks, cracks and bullet holes are all fairly deep and should hold paint and washes pretty well. I like that the instructions were included on the box. It is a pretty simple build, but it does need to be put together in a fairly specific way. I also like that it includes a base, a pretty nicely detailed one at that. I do wish more debris to scatter around the place was included with this kit, but that's not exactly hard to add later. So all in all, scale considerations aside, I think it's a pretty decent model, and I will probably paint it fairly soon. I'd like to use it for my next solo bolt action game. So what do you think of this wrecked house by Warlord Games? Is the fact that it's a little bit out of scale a deal breaker for you? Let me know in the comments section below. And of course, don't forget to do things like subscribing here on YouTube and following me on social media. And if you really like what I do, you can always help support the channel over at patreon.com/Erpaderp. That would be most excellent. Check the links in the description for further information. I shall return soon, so until then, happy modelling and thanks for watching. Farewell.